Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in Boston. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It is always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. Let's begin. The year was 1918, and Boston was wrapped in the pale quiet of an autumn already steeped in grief. The air carried a strange mix of disinfectant and coal smoke, drifting through streets where carts rolled heavy with the dead. The great influenza had reached the city weeks earlier, filling hospitals, schools, and finally, the small funeral parlors that lined Tremont and Cambridge streets. According to city health records of that season, many now stored in brittle folders at the Suffolk archives, there were so many bodies that undertakers had begun to store them wherever space allowed. One of those parlors belonged to a man named Edwin Larch, a middle-aged embalmer with quiet manners and a reputation for tidiness. Locals said he rarely spoke above a murmur, his sentences clipped as if weighed for efficiency. His establishment, Larch & Sons Mortuary, sat between a shuttered bakery and an abandoned tailor's shop. The storefront looked modest, but the basement stretched deep, originally carved from older cellars once used by merchants before the Civil War. In early October, the Boston Evening Transcript briefly mentioned the mortuary in a single paragraph. Nothing scandalous, just a note of its commendable service amid trying times. But neighbors would later recall something odd about those nights. One, a young seamstress named Agnes Mallory told a reporter years later, "The lights burned till morning. You could hear footsteps below the street, long after the last cart had gone." The Wikipedia reference to the 1918 influenza pandemic helps set this stage. Across Boston, temporary morgues overflowed, and undertakers like Larch were pushed to their limits. With churches closed and clergy overwhelmed, much of the city's mourning went unseen, confined to cellars and curtained rooms. Yet something about Larch's routines seemed to stray from the standard. He declined offers of help even from his apprentice, and when the health commissioner's inspectors visited, they found doors locked and windows papered from the inside. Records from the Office of Vital Statistics show that Larch signed for more cadavers than his parlor officially processed, 5, maybe 6, unaccounted for. By November, when the epidemic's worst had passed, a faint unease lingered in that part of the South End. Children whispered that Larch kept voices in his basement. Adults ignored it, as people do when grief still hangs like fog over their days. But one constable, Thomas Grady, made a note in his patrol ledger after passing by the mortuary on November 22nd. He described in careful script a strong odor, not of rot but of damp and lye, something chemical. It would be another winter before anyone truly questioned what lay beneath Larch's quiet little parlor. The following spring brought no relief to the city. Boston's skies turned bright again, but the funeral carts still rattled through narrow alleys. What the papers called a season of recovery was for many a time of strange absences, neighbors who never returned, letters unanswered, properties quietly sold. The Larch mortuary remained open, though fewer coffins were seen delivered to its door. According to the Boston Registry of Deeds, Edwin Larch purchased the building outright in May 1919, paying in cash. The seller, an aging sea captain named Jonas Prentice, noted in his affidavit that the basement was larger than expected, with 2 bricked chambers sealed from the main hall. He asked no further questions, claiming the undertaker seemed utterly respectable. That phrase would repeat in later testimonies, utterly respectable, always said with unease. Inside the mortuary, accounts from Larch's surviving apprentice, Harold Keene, give the first glimpses of strangeness. Keene's handwritten recollections, preserved in a faded leather notebook, describe his employer's rituals: nightly polishing of metal instruments, candlelight vigils over unclaimed bodies, and his insistence that certain cadavers not be moved until the hour is right. Keene mentioned how Larch hummed hymns under his breath, though he was never known to attend church. Midway through the notebook, Keene references the same 1918 influenza pandemic that had once overwhelmed the city, writing that Mr. Larch believed the fever had not truly ended, that something unseen lingered among the dead. The line has puzzled researchers ever since, particularly because Larch kept several sealed crates labeled only with the year 1918. By autumn, local gossip began circling again. A constable's wife swore she saw pale shapes through the mortuary's rear windows. A milkman refused to deliver there after dawn. It was around this time that a fire broke out 2 doors down, and when firefighters arrived, they noted Larch's door was bolted from inside. He appeared hours later, soot on his collar, claiming he'd been working in the lower room. None asked which room he meant. The neighborhood had begun to empty, families moving toward Roxbury or Cambridge, fleeing both memory and illness. Those who stayed recalled an increasing number of animals found dead near the mortuary fence. Cats, dogs, once even a horse, collapsed with no sign of violence. Dr. Elijah Corbin, a local physician, wrote in his 1920 field diary that he suspected toxic runoff from the embalming chemicals. Still, his notes add, "There was an odor of decay I could not place. It clung to the stones themselves." Meanwhile, in public view, Larch remained courteous. He spoke gently at funerals, donated small sums to the church orphanage, and corresponded politely with the Massachusetts Board of Health regarding new mortuary guidelines issued after the pandemic. His letters survive, written in elegant cursive full of civic duty, yet one line in his July 1920 reply unsettled the clerk who read it. "I continue my studies with the still and the silent, as they have much yet to teach." That summer, Harold Keene left the mortuary and vanished from city directories altogether. Within months, Boston police would begin receiving quiet, anonymous tips about strange digging sounds in the nights along Tremont Street. By early 1921, the South End had grown weary of whispers. The influenza years had carved deep grooves in the city's mood. Grief had become an old tenant no one dared evict. Still, the rumors surrounding Larch & Sons mortuary began to feel different, less like superstition, more like the slow surfacing of something real. A small article buried in the Boston Globe, dated February 17, 1921, mentioned a complaint of improper burials filed against an unnamed undertaker. Though no name appeared in print, locals knew exactly who was meant. A city inspector, Mr. Clifford Rains, later testified that he visited the parlor and found the lower rooms in untidy condition, with certain remains stored in a manner inconsistent with dignity. His report, preserved among county archives, stops short of accusation. Yet in the margins, written faintly in pencil, are 2 words: unaccounted corpses. Those who lived nearby said Larch's nightly habits intensified that year. He was seen carrying small wooden boxes into the basement, sometimes long after midnight. When questioned, he answered that these were personal experiments in preservation, a vague phrase that no one pressed further, for undertakers had become necessary and somewhat feared figures in the post-pandemic city. Once again, the shadow of the 1918 influenza pandemic hung over every conversation. Families still unearthed sealed trunks of black cloth masks, still avoided shaking hands, still whispered of contagion. In that climate, no one wanted to revisit the horrors of improper burial or tainted corpses. Silence, it seemed, was the only civic courtesy left. But silence has a way of cracking under repetition. That summer, a street worker repairing a drainage pipe behind the mortuary uncovered a row of disturbed soil, roughly 4 feet deep, each patch measuring the length of a man. Thinking it old groundwork, he nearly filled it back in before noticing something pale among the dirt. A fragment of cloth stiffened with preservative, and beneath it, part of a jawbone. The worker, Samuel Dorey, reported his find to the precinct on Shawmut Avenue. His statement, taken by Constable Grady, describes partial skeletal remains, no coffin wood, evidence of deliberate burial. The constable, remembering the previous odor he'd noted years earlier, sought a warrant. Yet by the time they returned to Larch's door, the undertaker was gone. His shop open, lamps still burning, tea still warm on the counter. What followed has puzzled historians ever since. Inside the cellar, police discovered the bricked chambers mentioned in the 1919 property sale. Each contained stone tables, brass instruments, and bottles, labeled with indecipherable shorthand. A ledger lay open on a desk. Its pages listed names, but not of clients. Rather, they appeared to be anatomical notes, entries such as specimen 14, discoloration reversed, tissue revived 3 hours post-injection. The files from that search were never publicly released. Some say they vanished in the municipal fire of 1925. Others believe they were withdrawn by the Massachusetts Department of Public Health, which, at the time, was still reorganizing from the influenza crisis. When the mortuary was finally sealed, neighbors spoke of a sudden cold that lingered in the alley for days. The smell of lye was replaced by something sharper, almost metallic, as if the air itself had remembered too much. The official closure of Larch & Sons mortuary was quietly recorded in early March 1921, only a few weeks after the discovery behind its walls. City clerks stamped the order with little ceremony. Boston, still recovering from years of sickness and shortages, preferred not to dwell on another dark curiosity. Yet those who entered the building that week, constables, a coroner, and 2 men from the Board of Health, left with stories they seldom repeated. Coroner Dr. Hiram Doolan later described the scene to a colleague in what would become his final interview before retirement. "It was no place of mourning," he said, "but a workshop, and the dead were not resting. They were arranged." His written report, though largely redacted, notes multiple specimens showing signs of post-mortem interference not consistent with preparation for burial. Among these were jars of pale organs suspended in an amber fluid and several unsealed coffins containing wax-coated remains, each tagged with small paper slips bearing only initials. On a shelf near the main embalming table, investigators found several issues of The Lancet and a tattered medical pamphlet referencing early preservation research from Europe. Curiously, one margin bore the phrase, "See Influenza Case Studies, Boston, 1918. The same wording appears in the Wikipedia-cited historical record of the 1918 influenza pandemic, which had documented how doctors experimented with chemical preservation to better study the virus' effect on tissue. It's unclear whether Larch participated officially in such research, but the timing, the materials, and his meticulous notes all suggest an obsession born from that tragic outbreak. Dr. Doolan E.S. account mentions one more disturbing detail: a row of wax molds shaped like human faces, each tagged by month and year. "He meant to restore them," Doolan speculated. "Not out of malice, but curiosity. He thought he could reverse what nature had done." As for the man himself, no one saw Edwin Larch after February 1921. Trains bound for New York and Providence were checked, ships departing from the harbor reviewed, yet no trace appeared. His bank account remained untouched, and the cash used to buy the building was never sourced. Some believed he fled to New Haven, where an anonymous embalmer was rumored to have taken work under a false name. Others swore he perished within his own walls, entombed by the cellar collapse that occurred later that spring. After the investigation, the property was sold to a stonemason named Louis Brenner, who intended to renovate it into a boarding house. Within 3 months, Brenner abandoned the project, claiming the lower floors wept through the walls. His brief affidavit, stored in the Suffolk archives, describes hearing a rhythmic tapping under the brick and seeing on one occasion a light flicker from behind a sealed door. When workers later demolished the parlor's rear section, they uncovered the outline of a door that led nowhere, just a solid wall of old mortar. Yet within that surface, embedded like a fossil, they found the imprint of a hand. The police dismissed it as an impression left by wet plaster, though Brenner's men swore it was set long after. The spring rains of 1922 turned Boston's South End into a wash of grey stone and glistening gutters. By then, the mortuary stood shuttered, its windows boarded, its name scraped off the door. Most residents had learned to walk past without glancing, but some, particularly the older ones, claimed they could still smell the faint sting of formaldehyde when the air grew damp. Across town, Constable Thomas Grady found himself still drawn to the matter. His superiors had told him plainly, "The case is closed. No charges filed, no suspect found." Yet something about the empty ledger pages and the bricked chambers unsettled him. He began spending his evenings in the Boston Public Library, combing through medical journals, searching for Larch's handwriting or references to his so-called studies. In June of that year, he located a peculiar article in an obscure periodical called The Anatomist's Quarterly. The piece, unsigned, described post-mortem stimulation experiments conducted in an urban coastal laboratory during the influenza years. The phrasing mirrored several lines from the large ledger found in the cellar. Though the author's name was omitted, one margin note read, "Procedure refined since the epidemic of 1918. Once more, the 1918 influenza pandemic, as chronicled in the Wikipedia-cited historical accounts, hovered like a ghost over every lead. It reminded Grady how easily men of science had blurred moral lines during that crisis, testing, dissecting, preserving, all in the name of understanding the invisible. Could Larch have seen himself as part of that movement, a misguided researcher rather than a villain? Grady shared his suspicions with Dr. Elijah Corbin, the same physician who years before had noted the strange odor near the parlor. Corbin listened quietly, then retrieved from his files a yellowed envelope sealed with wax. Inside lay 3 small photographs, each showing what appeared to be a preserved cadaver, features unnaturally smooth, eyes closed, skin faintly luminous under gaslight. On the back of one image, written in looping script, were the initials E.L. Corbin, admitted he'd received them anonymously in 1919 as part of a medical exchange. He had assumed they came from a university experiment and filed them away. But the return address, long since faded, had once read simply, South End, Tremont Street. The constable pressed for more, but Corbin refused, saying only, "There are sciences we abandoned for good reason." That summer, the old mortuary caught the attention of a group of Harvard medical students who requested permission to study the building as an example of early 20th century embalming practice. Permission was denied, yet 2 of them, names later lost to record, were caught trespassing one evening. In their statement, they claimed the basement floor still held faint white outlines where tables once stood, and a faint groove in the brick shaped like a drain channel. One student swore the walls sweated a clear film that glistened under the lamp. Their testimony was quietly suppressed, and the property was condemned later that year due to structural decay. But the constable's final note, scribbled in his ledger before retirement, remains the most telling. It reads simply, "Nothing buried stays quiet if it was never meant to rest." By the winter of 1923, the old mortuary had become a neighborhood scar, its outline visible from the street, yet its story kept hushed among adults who didn't want their children curious. The building's upper floor windows sagged inward, glass spider-webbed with frost, and snow gathered where the roof had begun to cave. Despite the city's order of condemnation, the structure remained standing, trapped in bureaucratic limbo between demolition and neglect. Constable Grady had long since retired to a small house near Jamaica Plain, but even in retirement, the case lingered in his thoughts. He corresponded occasionally with the Massachusetts Historical Society, sending brief letters about an unsolved matter of mortuary practice, though few took notice. In one such letter, he described how he had visited the ruins that autumn. "The air was stale," he wrote, "and the basement colder than the frost above it. I swear I heard dripping, though there was no leak to be found." A young reporter named Helen Varner from the Boston Daily Advertiser caught wind of Grady's recollections. Intrigued by the silence surrounding the property, she sought access through the Public Works Department, claiming to be researching urban decay. Her field notes, discovered decades later in a trunk labeled 1923-1924, describe what she saw inside. Tables rusted to skeletons of iron, shelves warped with moisture, and in one corner a stack of medical pamphlets waterlogged but legible. Among them was a pamphlet titled "Advances in Post-Mortem Preservation During the Influenza Period." The echo of that pandemic, the same 1918 influenza referenced earlier and chronicled in medical and historical records, haunted every trace of this story. The pamphlet repeated theories once circulated in scientific circles about reanimation via chemical stimulation. While the author's name was smudged, a handwritten note at the margin read, "E.L. attempted variant 4, failure due to temperature." Helen noted another peculiarity. Near the back wall, she found a section of floor where the dust pattern was disturbed, as though something square and heavy had been removed. Beneath the dust, carved faintly into the stone, were letters so eroded they could only be partially read. Mort Vivi. She copied them into her notebook, translating from Latin later as "the dead who live." After filing her report, Helen planned a follow-up article, but the draft was never printed. The advertiser ES Archives show a single internal memo referencing her piece. Story withdrawn. Insufficient verification. Within weeks, she left Boston for Chicago, leaving no forwarding address. Local folklore began to take hold soon after. Children dared each other to touch the mortuary's rusted door handle at dusk, believing it still shocked with the chill of the dead. An old street sweeper named Ben Nichols told younger workers he'd seen a candle burning inside one January night, though the building had no glass left to block the wind. When he went closer, the flame vanished, yet the smell of camphor filled the air. By summer, the city finally sent demolition crews to finish the job. But as the wreckers began, their foreman halted work, reporting that their drills met solid resistance beneath the foundation, as if there was more brick than building beneath. The site was left half-cleared and fenced. The partially cleared lot sat untouched for months. By early 1924, weeds had pushed through the cracked pavement, and melted snow revealed fragments of the building's old tile flooring. The city planned to auction the land, but no bidder appeared. Word had spread that tools rusted overnight on that ground, that fires lit nearby burned low and blue, as if the air refused to feed them. Amid the growing urban renewal of the South End, the lot became a quiet anomaly, a remnant of the darker years after the 1918 influenza pandemic, still referenced in local council minutes as a property of special sanitation concern. That language, drawn from the same historic framework found in the Wikipedia-cited influenza records, reveals how fear of contagion lingered even in paperwork. People spoke less of Edwin Larch himself and more of the undertaker's ground, as though the man had merged with the soil. In the spring thaw, an unexpected visitor arrived at the site, Dr. Elijah Corbin, now retired and frail, walking with a cane. He told a young municipal officer that he wished to see the end of that chapter. Witnesses said he spent several hours standing where the mortuary cellar once opened, murmuring under his breath. That evening, he visited the home of Constable Grady, who noted the meeting in his diary. "Corbin came pale as ash," the entry reads. He brought a small parcel wrapped in cloth, claiming it belonged to Larch's estate. He would not open it. Grady never described what was inside, but days later, Corbin collapsed on Tremont Street and died of what the attending doctor called heart failure induced by agitation. The parcel was not listed among his personal effects. Following the doctor's death, several local boys sneaked into the fenced lot, scavenging bricks to sell for scrap. One of them, Patrick Dwyer, later gave an account to a journalist in 1942. "We went in after dusk, and there was still a hole in the ground, a kind of pit half filled with rain. One of us threw a stone and it hit something hollow. They climbed down, scraping mud from what appeared to be an iron chest, the size of a small coffin. When they pried at the latch, the lid gave way, and a wave of air escaped so cold it felt alive. Inside were rows of glass jars, many shattered, their contents black with mold. The boys fled, and by morning the pit had partly collapsed. The city later filled it with concrete, labeling it unstable substructure. No mention of jars or chest appeared in official records. For a time, people thought that would be the end of it. Yet nearby residents spoke of a faint humming in the evenings, as though from underground. Low, rhythmic, the same tune Larch had once been heard to hum while at work. The tone drifted through the alleyways on damp nights, barely audible, gone as soon as one tried to trace it. And then, as summer deepened, another discovery drew attention back to Tremont Street, one that tied the mystery to a far older name than Edwin Larch. When workers began extending the streetcar line that summer, their shovels bit into a layer of old foundation beneath the filled lot. Beneath the concrete poured after the collapse, they found another structure, older than the mortuary itself. According to the Boston Public Works Survey of 1924, the sub-basement appeared to predate the Civil War, constructed of rough granite blocks and timber beams blackened by time. One foreman remarked it felt more like a vault than a cellar. Within this forgotten layer, the men uncovered a rusted plaque inscribed faintly with the year 1859 and a name, J. Prentice and Coers, importers of medicinals. That name, the same as the sea captain who had sold the building to Edwin Larch years earlier, appeared again in an old shipping ledger from the Boston Maritime Archive. It listed deliveries of preservatives, spirits, and anatomical supplies. The implication unsettled city officials. Had the building been used for experimental work long before Larch arrived? The discovery briefly revived newspaper interest. A column in the Boston Herald ran under the title, "Unearthed Chamber Rekindles Mortuary Mystery." The article referenced unidentified chemical containers and a small stone basin built into the floor. No evidence of human remains was found, but one worker told a reporter that when the basin was first uncovered, it steamed as though it remembered something warm. The description was dismissed as superstition, yet others insisted the chamber held a residue like embalming fluid. By now, the 1918 influenza pandemic, still noted in public health circles, and the Wikipedia-documented reports, had become a historical marker for Boston's years of excess mortality. Scholars studying the crisis drew faint parallels between the era's frantic medical research and the sort of preservationist obsession seen in Larch A.S. records. The timing suggested that Larch may have rediscovered an older facility and adapted it to his purposes, a continuation rather than an origin. Constable Grady, aged but still alert, visited the excavation site one final time. Workers recognized him and allowed him a few minutes alone inside the newly unearthed vault. He described it later in a letter to his nephew. There was no smell, only cold. The stones seemed to breathe. I touched one wall and felt a hollow behind it, like air shifting. It was not imagination. I heard a faint knock, 2 beats, then nothing. The excavation was halted soon afterward when a section of the vault collapsed, injuring 2 men. The city ordered the remaining space filled and sealed under reinforced cement. Officially, it became part of the streetcar's foundation. Unofficially, several workers refused to return, claiming their tools vibrated in their hands whenever they approached the filled area. In the following months, the lot was paved over completely. A lamppost was installed at its edge, flickering irregularly despite multiple repairs. Locals joked that the light never liked staying on past midnight. By the year's end, the story of Edwin Larch had almost slipped into myth, until an unexpected letter arrived at the office of the Boston Board of Health, stamped from Providence, Rhode Island, bearing only 3 words. Your corpse keeper continues. The letter reached Boston in early 1925, addressed to no specific official. The clerk who opened it assumed it was a prank until he read the signature at the bottom, H. Keene. The name jolted several in the department. Harold Keene, Larch's former apprentice, had been presumed dead or vanished since 1920. His sudden reappearance, even by post, was enough to reopen quiet internal discussion about the mortuary's case files, long sealed after the investigation. The letter itself was short and oddly formal, written in the same measured script found in the old Larch ledgers. Keene wrote that he had continued the work under improved conditions, claiming the earlier failures were due to impure compounds and excess decay from influenza cadavers. The phrasing echoed terminology found in official medical circulars from the 1918 influenza pandemic, still referenced in historical and Wikipedia-documented correspondence from that era. He mentioned new techniques involving preservative infusion prior to death, a line that made even seasoned inspectors uneasy. An inquiry was quietly launched, though without public notice. 2 agents from the Massachusetts State Police were sent to Providence to locate Keene. They found no trace of him, but a boarding house owner remembered a lodger by that name who paid cash and left behind several heavy trunks. The trunks, turned over to authorities, contained medical instruments, glass tubing, and 3 ledgers marked 1919-1924. The contents were described later in a confidential memorandum. Each volume records experiments in tissue retention, referencing numerous unverified subjects and cross-referencing notes from EL 1918. In one entry, dated December 1924, Keene wrote, "He remains preserved beyond expectation, neural elasticity responsive, pulse faint but present." Investigators could not determine whether he referred to Larch or another subject. Meanwhile, a series of odd incidents began in Providence's industrial district. Morgue attendants reported missing cadavers, only to have them returned days later in slightly altered condition, cleaned, stitched, and chemically treated. A janitor at the Hope Street Anatomy Annex told police he saw a man in a dark coat wheeling a stretcher at midnight, though no staff were scheduled at that hour. Newspapers never learned of these events, but the internal notes of the Board of Health show growing alarm. Officials debated whether to inform the public, fearing a repeat of the hysteria that had followed the influenza outbreak years earlier. Ultimately, they chose silence. The last recorded mention of Harold Keane appears in a telegram from the Providence Constabulary dated July 8, 1925. Suspect believed to have boarded train southbound. Left behind unclaimed parcel addressed to Tremont Street, Boston. The parcel, when opened, contained a single wax face mold, the same type once described in Dr. Doolan's 1921 report. Beneath it lay a slip of paper reading, "Failure reversed. Returning home." That autumn, a fire consumed part of the South End S streetcar depot, the very section built over the mortuary site. Witnesses claimed the flames burned white and silent, with no smoke. When firefighters broke through the ground to contain it, they found no fuel source, only a hollow space where the earth had fallen inward. And as the ashes cooled, one worker swore he saw impressions of boot prints leading away from the crater. Prints that sank into solid stone, then stopped mid-stride. The 1925 streetcar depot fire marked the official end of the Larch investigation, at least on paper. The Board of Health archived its files under closed cases, no further public interest, and the lot was rebuilt once more. Yet those who lived near Tremont Street whispered that the ground itself had turned restless. Tram operators reported electrical surges whenever their routes passed the site. One even noted that his pocket watch stopped at midnight each time his car rolled over that stretch. The following year brought a spate of strange disappearances, small, seemingly unrelated cases. A night watchman, 2 vagrants, a stray morgue attendant. None drew headlines, but in each instance, police found an odor faintly reminiscent of antiseptic, lingering long after search parties dispersed. One officer described it as sweet, like lilac water and iron. Among those few still obsessed with the mortuary case was Helen Varner, the journalist who had explored the property in 1923 before fleeing Boston for Chicago. She returned briefly in 1926, writing privately to a friend that she had been summoned by a correspondence impossible to ignore. The letter she referenced, now preserved in the Boston University archive, bore no signature, only a stamped wax seal depicting a stylized skull surrounded by ivy. Inside, the writer claimed to be continuing the research of the South End facility and requested her presence to witness proof of vitality preserved. Helen never reached her appointment. Her hotel room at the Tremont house was found empty, her suitcase half-packed, and her typewriter ribbon freshly inked with the unfinished line, "The Undertaker S. Hum returns beneath the street." The investigation yielded nothing. Her name was quietly added to a list of unresolved vanishings. Once more, the 1918 influenza pandemic, recorded in historical reports and Wikipedia-cited medical documentation, surfaced in official correspondence. A 1926 memorandum from the Massachusetts Pathology Board noted that several chemicals seized from unauthorized labs matched those once used in early pandemic preservation studies. The memo warned of amateurs revisiting post-mortem experimentation under pseudo-scientific pretense. No names were given, though the initials EL and HK were circled faintly in pencil on the surviving copy. Constable Grady, then in his 70s, wrote one final letter before withdrawing from public life. Addressed to the state archivist, it read, "If there is a soul left in the dead, these men have trapped it between breath and silence. I have walked that street at night and felt the ground hum under my feet. Perhaps the city is the tomb now, and we the restless." That same winter, a severe frost cracked the pavement along Tremont Street. Maintenance workers reported steam rising from the fissures, though the temperature was well below freezing. One claimed he heard what sounded like distant singing, slow and even, echoing from beneath the stones. Afterward, the city filled the cracks with fresh tar. By spring, the hum had faded again, but not for long. For just before the decade turned, new tenants would arrive, unaware of what slept beneath their foundations. By 1929, Tremont Street bore little resemblance to the district of the epidemic years. Cafes replaced the old warehouses, and the streetcar depot had been rebuilt into a modest apartment block called the Ashworth Residences, a clean, symmetrical brick building with iron balconies and gas lamps that flickered gently at dusk. Few of its new tenants knew or cared that it stood on the filled ruins of the Larch Mortuary. Boston had turned its gaze forward, determined to forget its shadows. The first to move in were clerks, war widows, and a few foreign students. Alcott, newly married and eager for quiet study, rented the corner flat on the third floor. In his journals, recovered decades later, he described how the floor sometimes vibrated at night, as though heavy wagons passed below, though there is no street beneath. His wife, Eveline, insisted it was the pipes, yet she too noted the faint smell of antiseptic that drifted through the vents every rainstorm. During that same year, Alcott began compiling a paper on the legacy of the 1918 influenza pandemic, cross-referencing several contemporary sources, including many later summarized in Wikipedia's historical record. He noted the strange persistence of laboratories and private researchers obsessed with post-mortem preservation, calling it a lingering contagion of the mind. In his drafts, one footnote refers cryptically to a Boston case file sealed under municipal order, exhibiting continuity of method. Alcott's research drew him to the archives of the Board of Health, where he found partial fragments of Larch's correspondence, letters once thought destroyed in the municipal fire. Most were polite, bureaucratic, discussing supply shortages and disinfectant formulas. But one, dated January 1919, carried an ominous line. Our failures were not final, merely interrupted by circumstance. The bodies still whisper when treated correctly. Soon after reading that letter, Alcott began to hear noises in his own building. Not footsteps exactly, but a low rhythmic sound from beneath the floorboards, soft, almost musical. He traced it to the cellar, which was accessible only through a service stair locked by the superintendent. The man refused to lend him the key, muttering that the floor down there was poured twice, and still it moves. Neighbors started reporting odd disturbances too. A child in the second flat told her mother she had seen a man in a brown coat with glass eyes walking in the hallway at dawn. The mother dismissed it as nightmare, until the child produced a small metal tag she said she found under the radiator, engraved with the initials E.L. That summer, Eveline Alcott fell ill with a persistent fever. Peter recorded her symptoms in meticulous notes, comparing them to historical influenza cases. Yet her skin took on a strange pallor, waxy rather than pale. She sleeps without breath, he wrote, but her body remains warm. On July 12, 1929, Dr. Alcott vanished. His apartment was found neat, books stacked in order, the bed empty save for a faint outline, as if someone had lain there moments before. In the center of the desk sat a single jar, sealed tight with wax. Inside, a human heart suspended in amber liquid, pulsing once every few minutes. The disappearance of Dr. Peter Alcott baffled Boston authorities. The Ashworth Residences, barely a year old, had prided itself on discretion, yet whispers of the missing doctor spread fast. Residents described hearing the same faint humming he'd once noted in his journal, and one tenant swore she heard a heartbeat through the pipes. When investigators arrived, they sealed off the flat and transported the jar to the Harvard Medical College for examination. Professor Henry Dumont, who oversaw the pathology department, described the specimen as anatomically consistent with a male adult, perfectly preserved. He wrote in his 1930 report, "The heart maintains rhythmic contractions independent of any mechanical influence, duration uncertain." The sample was kept under observation for 6 days before mysteriously vanishing from the lab's cold storage. The night watchman claimed no one entered, though a faint trail of condensation led to the rear exit. In reviewing Alcott's papers, investigators found more references to the 1918 influenza pandemic. echoing the same historical accounts found in Wikipedia's medical chronology today. One of Alcott A.S. notes cited necrotic tissue from influenza victims as catalyst for revival attempts. The phrasing aligned disturbingly with Larch A.S. old experiments and the ledgers of Harold Keane recovered years before. A line scrawled at the edge of the final page read, "He lives again beneath the stone." By autumn, the Ashworth building had gained an unsavory reputation. Tenants complained of drafts that smelled faintly of camphor, and the superintendent reported soft knocking from the basement, despite it being sealed. On October 19th, a young maintenance worker named Louis Moran attempted to break open the cellar door to locate a suspected leak. When the door finally splintered, a rush of cold air poured out, extinguishing every lantern. Witnesses heard Moran scream once. When light returned, he was gone. Police concluded he must have fallen into an access shaft, though none was found. What they did find, however, was the faint outline of a second door beyond the wall, its edges outlined in an oily residue that shimmered under lamplight. Workers sealed it again, this time with riveted steel. Constable Grady, nearing the end of his life, read of these events from his home and sent a final letter to the Massachusetts Historical Society. "I have watched this pattern repeat since 18. The fever, the bodies, the hum, the same scent, the same silence before discovery. It is not one man. It is the work itself, alive through those who touch it." The letter was filed away and forgotten for decades, but rumors persisted among students at Harvard that a hidden storage room beneath the college's medical wing contained the Larch relics, unlabeled jars and face molds kept behind a false wall. When maintenance was done in 1932, a worker found a rusted label wedged in a floor seam. The text, nearly erased by time, bore the initials E.L. and the date 1918, followed by two Latin words barely legible under grime: Corpus Custos, the keeper of the body. By then, Boston had changed again, yet the hum beneath Tremont Street had not ceased. It waited, steady as breath beneath the city's new rhythm. By 1933, Boston was deep in the Depression. Streets once bright with electric signs had gone dim, and half the Ashworth apartments stood vacant. The building's owners struggled to attract tenants. The place had earned a quiet reputation for nervous walls. A faint vibration, barely perceptible, was said to pass through the floorboards on certain nights, like a pulse beneath wood. The property's manager, Mr. Clarence Hollis, tried to dismiss the rumors. Yet in his personal correspondence, preserved decades later in the municipal collection, he described something unnerving. The radiators tick in rhythm, and if one listens long enough, they begin to answer each other. He wrote that several residents claimed to hear a voice through the heating vents, humming an indistinct hymn. When a tenant on the third floor moved out, she left behind a single line scrawled across her mirror: "He keeps them still." That same winter, Harvard archivists began recataloguing their medical holdings and came upon an unnumbered crate stored deep within the sub-basement of the pathology wing. Inside were glass slides, early embalming tools, and a small ledger bearing the initials HK. Its entries ceased abruptly after July 1925, but earlier pages repeated the same phrase found in Larch S notes: preservation before expiration. The crate also contained a letter addressed to E.L. Tremont Street, Boston, dated March 1919, thanking the recipient for providing fresh influenza subjects for testing. The recurrence of those epidemic years, the 1918 influenza pandemic, documented in medical and Wikipedia-cited history, appeared now less as tragedy than origin. Across Massachusetts, records showed that many undertakers had volunteered their facilities for research on contagion. Larch, it seemed, had merely taken that civic duty too far, convinced that death could be delayed by mastery of chemistry and will. In February 1933, a sudden frost burst a pipe in the Ashworth cellar, forcing workmen to reopen the lower access. When they descended, they found not a single chamber, but two. The second had never appeared on the building plans. Within it lay shelves lined with jars, hundreds of them, each containing a waxy organ suspended in amber solution. A handwritten placard hung above the nearest shelf, barely legible under decades of grime: "Continuation, P. Alcott." Authorities arrived quickly, sealing the space and removing its contents under guard. The official report listed chemical specimens of indeterminate medical origin, but a short paragraph later struck through with ink read, "One jar exhibited pulsing motion upon exposure to light, ceased after 10 minutes. Hollis resigned soon after, claiming the building breathed at night. Tenants scattered, and the Ashworth stood empty again. City inspectors considered demolition, but funding never came. Instead, the building was left to rot behind plywood and weeds. That spring, a group of schoolchildren wandering through the alley swore they saw light seeping from cracks in the cellar wall, greenish and faint, like lanterns underwater. When they told their teacher, she laughed it off, yet one boy insisted, "It was moving, miss, like something alive trying to shine." And somewhere beneath those bricks, the hum began again, steady, patient, and growing louder with every thaw. By 1935, the city had nearly forgotten the Ashworth building, though the structure itself refused to surrender. Its facade sagged like tired skin, ivy crawling across boarded windows. Only the occasional vagrant sought shelter there, unaware or unwilling to believe, the stories whispered in nearby taverns. The Depression had hardened people to fear. Ghosts, after all, could not repossess a house. That spring, a Works Progress Administration team was assigned to clear derelict structures for safety surveys. Among their list, Ashworth Residences, Tremont Street, condemned since 1933. On May 9th, 4 men entered to conduct their inspection. Only 2 emerged by nightfall. The survivors, Joseph Merrin and Earl Toomey, gave statements preserved in the Suffolk County archives. Merrin described descending into the cellar, where he found rows of sealed jars in neat order, not dusty, as if someone tended them. He claimed a faint electric light glowed at the far end, though no power reached the building. Toomey's account added another detail. There was a table, metal, with straps. The air moved like it was breathing. Then something knocked once beneath the floor, hard enough to shake the lamps. Police, skeptical, blamed gas pockets trapped under the foundation. Yet both men refused to re-enter the site, insisting the sound had rhythm. A week later, Merrin left Boston entirely, writing to a friend that the dead under Tremont are not still. Meanwhile, a local historian, Professor Leland Rowe, began compiling a chronicle of Boston's lesser-known tragedies. His section on medical anomalies referenced the 1918 influenza pandemic, citing it, as Wikipedia, and historical records still do, as the event that flooded the city's morgues and inspired questionable scientific curiosity. Rowe's draft linked Larch's experiments, Alcott's disappearance, and the later Ashworth incidents into one lineage of obsession, a contagion not of body but of persistence. In July, Rowe received an anonymous parcel at his Cambridge office. Inside was a single glass slide, cracked at the edge. Under magnification, it revealed a thin section of tissue that twitched once, then went still. The professor locked it in a specimen box and made a note in his journal. Impossible. Response to warmth confirmed. Later that year, vandals set fire to the Ashworth building, perhaps hoping to erase the legend once and for all. The blaze burned through the night, consuming timbers and brick alike. Yet when dawn came, city workers found the cellar untouched, stone walls blackened but intact, and within that unburned chamber lay fresh footprints in the soot, leading toward the sealed rear door. The incident was never reported publicly. Boston had other worries then, unemployment, breadlines, storms. But those living near the site spoke of the glow that rose from the ground for weeks after, a pulse of dim light, like the heartbeat of the city itself, too slow to see, but steady enough to feel. And sometimes, they said, if you pressed your ear to the pavement above the old mortuary ground, you could still hear a man humming softly, a song half lost to time, keeping perfect rhythm with the unseen beat below. By 1937, Tremont Street had become almost unrecognizable. New trolley lines clattered overhead, and the old Ashworth lot was fenced once again, slated for conversion into a municipal storage yard. Few remembered what the ground had once held, save for the oldest officers at the precinct and the handful of archivists who still handled the sealed files marked Larch Keen Alcott. Even then, the case was little more than a local legend, dismissed by younger men as superstition from the influenza years. The surveyor assigned to assess the property was Mr. Roland Dees, a practical engineer with little patience for folklore. His notebook, however, tells a different story. During the first week of measurements, Dees recorded a curious vibration beneath the western edge of the lot. Subsurface tremor, not seismic, recurring at roughly 6-second intervals. He added that his compass needle refused to settle, swinging gently toward the center of the yard where, decades earlier, the mortuary's basement had stood. On his third visit, Dees was joined by an assistant who noted the distinct scent of camphor. They traced the odor to a patch of concrete darker than the rest. When tapped with a survey rod, it sounded hollow. The engineer marked the spot for later excavation, but by morning the mark was gone, the surface smooth again as if repoured. He wrote in frustration, "Either I misremembered, or the earth corrected itself." That summer, a sudden heat wave swept Boston. Asphalt softened and the city's older buildings seemed to sweat moisture from their walls. At the fenced lot, passers-by noticed a faint shimmer rising from the ground at dusk, like heat haze. Street boys dared each other to throw pebbles over the fence. Each stone landed with a dull, wet sound, though the yard was dry as dust. Meanwhile, a researcher at Harvard Medical College, Dr. Mabel Houghton, began re-examining early embalming records for a paper on post-pandemic medicine. In her references, some still cited in Wikipedia's documentation of the 1918 influenza pandemic, she found Larch A's name listed beside those who had donated cadaver materials for pathology study. The discovery unsettled her, as no official record ever confirmed his death or burial. Houghton wrote to a colleague, "He is the one constant variable in 30 years of disappearance." Late in August, Dees returned alone to the yard, intent on confirming the anomaly. His notebook ends abruptly that day. The last entry reads, "The hum is louder now, steady, rhythmic, almost like a breath. Beneath the heat the air tastes of metal. There's light through the crack, green, then red." He never returned home. His tools were found neatly arranged beside the fence, and one boot print led toward the center of the lot, pressed deep into solid concrete. The city postponed all construction afterward, citing unstable foundation conditions. Workers filled the space once more and paved it over, this time with reinforced asphalt. Officials said the matter was closed, the site secure at last. Yet old men in the neighborhood claimed the ground still trembled after midnight, quiet, patient, and waiting, as though something below was learning again how to breathe. By 1939, the war in Europe dominated every newspaper, and Boston's attention had turned outward. The city expanded, modernized, and buried its own ghosts beneath new roads and trolleys. The Tremont lot, once the site of Larch's mortuary, became a minor power substation for the transit line. Thick cables descended into the same soil that had resisted shovels for decades. Workers complained of interference, tools sparking without contact, compasses reversing polarity. Engineers chalked it up to magnetic distortion from the underground wiring. But within months of the station's completion, the first reports began. Operators manning the night shift heard humming through the conduits, a low, even tone that matched the rhythm of the current. The superintendent, Edward Halsey, logged several incidents in his work journal. 11:42 p.m. Sound consistent with voice modulation, origin undetermined. Another entry read, "Frequency corresponds to human heartbeat. Impossible, but measurable." In one instance, when the main breaker failed, Halsey descended into the sub-level to check the fault. His assistant, waiting above, heard him call out once, then silence. Moments later, all the lights in the station glowed a deep green before flickering back to normal. Halsey returned 10 minutes later, pale and shaking. His watch stopped at exactly the moment of the blackout. He resigned 2 days after, leaving only a note. He's part of the current now. The Massachusetts Energy Commission inspected the substation that winter. Their findings remain classified, but a brief paragraph in the city's maintenance log, since digitized and cited in modern histories of the 1918 influenza pandemic, records an anomaly. Trace of organic matter detected on cable sheathing, consistent with preserved tissue. Investigators blamed contaminated gloves. Others weren't so sure. Meanwhile, archivists at the Harvard School of Public Health uncovered a misfiled box during cataloging, contents dated 1918 to 1921. Inside were photographs of mortuary interiors, each labeled with handwritten notes. Boston, Influenza Series. One image showed what appeared to be Edwin Larch himself, standing beside a table lined with glass jars. His eyes looked closed, yet the reflection in the photograph's varnish seemed to show them open. The image drew quiet academic curiosity. No one could identify the photographer. Yet rumors spread among graduate students that the negative emitted a faint static hum when held against a phonograph diaphragm, as though the photograph carried a trace of sound. That spring, a new power fluctuation caused a brief blackout across the South End. Witnesses described hearing a collective sigh rise from beneath the streets. In one apartment above the substation, a tenant later reported condensation forming on her windows in the shape of letters, EL, which faded within minutes. To this day, the city records list the Tremont substation as structurally sound, though technicians still note periodic unexplained harmonics in the underground lines. And old residents, those few who remember the story, say the sound is fainter now, but not gone. If you stand near the iron grates after midnight, they claim you can feel the warmth of breath rising through the cold metal, slow, measured, like someone waiting for the next charge to begin again. By 1941, the city's expansion had fully absorbed Tremont Street's old scars. War industries buzzed across Boston Harbor, and ration lines wound through the neighborhoods where once only hearses had rolled. The mortuary, the Ashworth, even the substation, all seemed reduced to rumor and dust, yet the hum persisted. Transit operators still mentioned it quietly, claiming the rails themselves vibrated faintly before every blackout, as if anticipating the surge. In that same year, a civil defense engineer named Arthur Penley was tasked with upgrading the substation's electrical shielding. Penley was meticulous, a former electrician who'd earned commendations for calm precision. His field log, later recovered from the archives of the Boston Department of Public Works, records a strange discovery. Subsurface resonance noted at 47 Hz, origin non-mechanical, similar to low vocal frequency. He tested the reading twice. The tone held steady, pulsing every 6 seconds. During maintenance one night in November, Penley descended alone into the lowest chamber of the substation to inspect a conduit junction. He never resurfaced. A search team found his flashlight still burning beside an open maintenance hatch. The space below was flooded with inches of standing water, warm despite the winter chill. Inside it floated his clipboard and a single scrap of cloth, monogrammed EL. Investigators sealed the hatch and declared it unsafe for entry. The official cause of death, accidental fall. Yet his supervisor's memo, filed but never released to the press, reads, "No body recovered, no trace of equipment, hum continues." That winter, the city was blanketed in blackout drills, streetlights dimmed, windows painted. Residents living near the substation reported that even when the city went dark, a faint green glow bled through the cracks in the pavement. It pulsed in time with the hum below, so slow that it seemed to follow breath rather than electricity. Among Boston's academic circles, the story re-emerged in a quiet exchange of letters. One professor from the Harvard Medical Library wrote to another that a newly found ledger contained marginalia connecting Larch E.S. revival experiments to the chemical trials conducted during the 1918 influenza pandemic. Trials that contemporary historians and later Wikipedia's cited records confirm took place in secret collaboration with undertakers. The professor ended his letter ominously. If he mastered the stillness between heartbeats, perhaps the current only woke him again. By spring of 1942, the substation's hum faded without explanation. The city celebrated the quiet as an engineering success. The vibrations stopped, the lights steadied, and the air no longer smelled of camphor. For a time, people believed the story had finally ended. But in June, a blackout struck the South End during a thunderstorm. Witnesses later described the return of the same rhythmic tone, steady, resonant, rising from deep underground. The frequency lasted exactly 12 minutes, long enough for several residents to step into the street and listen. When power returned, they found thin streaks of residue climbing the lampposts, pale wax-like trails shaped almost like fingerprints. By 1943, the war had drawn most of Boston's attention away from local mysteries. The Tremont substation, still operating quietly under rationed electricity, was manned by a skeleton crew. The hum had ceased for months, the lights remained steady, and city officials finally removed the restricted access signage that had hung there for nearly 2 decades. For the first time in years, it seemed the ground beneath the South End had settled into peace. But peace in Boston never held long where the dead once gathered. In April, a group of university archivists cataloguing wartime correspondence uncovered a set of glass plates mislabeled as Influenza Research, 1918 to 1919. When projected, the images showed a familiar basement, bricked walls, tables lined with jars, and in the background a man wearing an undertaker's apron. His posture was rigid, his hands folded neatly at his chest. The name etched along the plate's edge read, Edwin Larch, Study Number 3. Most disturbing of all was the date written beside it, May 1939. The discovery reignited old fears. Scholars who examined the negatives reported a faint discoloration, greenish halo surrounding the figure, identical to the light once described at the substation site. Among the marginal notes, one archivist found a slip of paper referencing the 1918 influenza pandemic, consistent with medical records and Wikipedia's documented accounts. Residual vitality confirmed through chemical and electrical stimulation. Recommend containment, not destruction. The archivist turned the materials over to the Boston Board of Health, but the plates vanished during transfer. Only a summary note remained, stamped, File closed. That summer, heavy rains flooded sections of the South End. At the substation, water seeped into the lower conduits, shorting several circuits. Technicians sent to repair the damage reported hearing a deep, rolling breath through the flooded shafts. One man dropped his lamp into the water and swore it illuminated a reflection, not of himself but of another face staring upward through the current. In July, the city paved over the last visible remnants of the old mortuary grounds. A commemorative plaque was never placed. Tremont Street bustled again, its shops busy, its streetcars bright and clattering. Yet on damp nights, when the air hung thick and metallic, residents along that stretch claimed to hear something faint beneath the cobblestones, a measured rhythm, older than electricity and steadier than the tide. Those who lingered long enough said it wasn't just sound but vibration, a pulse that climbed the soles of the feet and into the chest, and if one stood perfectly still, the pattern resolved into something almost human. 3 heartbeats, a pause, then 3 again. Perhaps it was nothing more than the city's ancient plumbing, the echo of old rails, or the memory of machines long buried. But some swore that if you pressed your hand to the ground where the mortuary once stood, the warmth that answered back was unmistakable. Not heat, exactly. Breath, still rising from Boston's buried dead.